There is a chapter in the Bible that pastors do not preach on Sunday mornings. A passage that seminary professors assign with a warning. A story so brutal, so deliberately disturbing, that even seasoned biblical scholars pause before they begin. It sits inside the book of Judges, near the end, almost as if someone tried to bury it beneath the weight of everything that came before. For 3,000 years, it has waited in the margins of history, not lost, not destroyed, not erased, simply ignored. And the silence around it is not accidental. The silence is the first clue. Picture ancient Israel at its lowest point. No king on the throne. No prophet speaking with authority. No central altar holding the nation together in worship. The land that God had promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the land purchased with 400 years of slavery in Egypt and 40 years of wandering through the desert, has become a place where every man does whatever he believes is right in his own eyes. That phrase appears at the very end of Judges, almost like an epitaph carved into a gravestone. It is not a description of freedom. It is a diagnosis of collapse. And Judges 19 is the fullest, most devastating expression of exactly how far that collapse had gone. On a road somewhere between the hill country of Ephraim and the city of Jerusalem, a man and a woman are traveling. They are not strangers. They are bound together by a bond the Hebrew text describes with a single word that carries centuries of legal and emotional weight. They have been separated. They are now reunited. And they are trying to get home. It should be an ordinary journey. A few days on familiar roads through the heart of the Promised Land. But the decision they make on the second evening, to stop in a city of their own people, rather than press on into foreign territory, will set in motion a chain of events so catastrophic that it nearly tears the nation of Israel apart forever. What happens in Gibeah that night is described in the Bible with a restraint that is almost more disturbing than explicit detail would be. The Hebrew text does not flinch. It does not look away. But it also does not explain, justify, or soften. It simply records. And what it records echoes, with terrifying precision, the story of Sodom from Genesis 19. The same knocking on the door, the same demand, the same offer of an innocent in exchange for another. The author of Judges did not choose that parallel by accident. He chose it because he wanted every reader who knew their scripture to feel the full weight of what he was saying. Israel had become Sodom. The Promised Land had become the city of destruction. What you are about to encounter is not a comfortable story. It was never meant to be. The Bible includes this account not to titillate, not to shock for the sake of shock, but because the truth about what human beings are capable of, when they abandon the covenant, when they discard justice, when they treat the vulnerable as instruments rather than image-bearers of God, must be spoken out loud, even when it is unbearable to hear. Because the darkness described in Judges 19 did not belong only to ancient Israel. It belongs to every civilization that has ever reached the same breaking point. And the question that haunts every page of this story is not whether it could happen again. The question is whether it already is. There are 31,102 verses in the Bible. Millions of people have read it cover to cover, studied it in seminaries, memorized entire books of it, built their entire lives around its words. And yet there is one passage, one specific chapter, that almost none of them have ever heard preached from a pulpit, explained in a Sunday school class, or explored in any serious depth by the teachers and pastors they trust. It is not hidden. It has not been removed from any modern translation. It sits right there in the plain text of the Old Testament, waiting. The silence around it is so complete, so consistent across centuries of Christian and Jewish tradition, that the silence itself becomes the most important question you could ask about it. Judges 19. Write it down if you need to, because by the time you finish hearing this story, you will never read the book of Judges the same way again. Most people who open the Bible to Judges are looking for familiar territory. Samson and his impossible strength, Deborah and her courage, Gideon and his fleece laid out before the Lord. Those are the stories that made it into the children's books, the Sunday school curricula, the inspirational posters. They are real, they are powerful, and they belong in the conversation. But they are also, in a very specific sense, the parts of Judges that are easy to package, the parts that fit neatly into a lesson about faith or obedience or divine intervention. Judges 19 does not fit neatly into anything. It resists packaging. It refuses to become a lesson with a clean takeaway. And that resistance is precisely why it matters. To understand why this chapter exists, you first need to understand what the book of Judges is actually doing. It is not a collection of heroic adventure stories, though it contains some of the most dramatic narratives in all of ancient literature. It is a theological argument, a case being built carefully and deliberately over the course of 21 chapters for a single devastating conclusion: that without covenant faithfulness, without the fear of God operating as the organizing principle of a society, human civilization does not drift slowly toward mediocrity. It collapses. It accelerates downward. It reaches a floor that most people, in their ordinary lives, cannot bring themselves to imagine. The book of Judges exists to show you that floor, and Judges 19 is the floor. The final chapters of Judges, chapters 17 through 21, are often called the appendices of the book because they do not follow the familiar pattern of the earlier cycles. There is no judge raised up to deliver Israel. There is no enemy army defeated, no miraculous intervention, no period of peace following repentance. Instead, the text gives us two stories in sequence, both set during the same era, both involving the tribe of Levi, both concerned with the catastrophic breakdown of the sacred covenant that was supposed to define Israel's identity as a people. The first story involves a man named Micah who builds a private shrine and hires a wandering Levite as his personal priest, as if the things of God were commodities to be purchased and arranged for personal convenience. The second story is Judges 19. And if the first story is a warning, the second story is the warning being ignored, and the consequences arriving in full. Detente un segundo. Think about what it means that these two stories were placed together at the end of the book after everything else. The author of Judges, and most scholars believe there was a single masterful editorial hand shaping the final form of this text, did not organize this material carelessly. Every placement is intentional. Every transition carries weight. By putting these stories at the end, after the reader has already watched Israel cycle through apostasy and deliverance again and again, the author is saying something that cannot be unsaid. He is saying, this is where the road leads. This is the destination of a people who have lost their moral and spiritual center. Not foreign conquest, not natural disaster. Something far more disturbing. A violence that rises from within. A destruction that the people themselves generate, against themselves, on the land they were given as a gift. Now here is something that most readers miss entirely, because they do not know what to look for. the phrase that closes the entire book of Judges. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes, from Judges 21, verse 25. Actually appears twice in the final section of the book. The first time is in Judges 17, verse 6, at the beginning of the appendix. The second time is at the very end. The author placed it like bookends, deliberately framing these two final stories with the same theological diagnosis. What you are reading in Judges 17 through 21 is not just a historical account. It is an illustration, a case study in what it looks like when a society loses the capacity to recognize evil, because the standard against which evil is measured has been abandoned. And Judges 19 is the centerpiece of that illustration. Guarda esa pregunta, because we are going to come back to it. But first, consider the woman at the center of this story. The Bible calls her a concubine, in Hebrew, a pilegesh, and that word has caused centuries of confusion, misreading, and erasure. Many readers hear concubine and assume they understand the situation. A secondary wife, a woman of lower status, a figure peripheral to the main narrative. But the Hebrew legal and social context is far more complex than that. A pilegesh in ancient Israel was a formally recognized partner, bound to a man by a real relationship with legal dimensions, not a servant or a slave. She had standing. She had a family who could advocate for her. And the text makes very clear, in Judges 19, verse 2, that she is a person with agency. She makes a decision that sets the entire story in motion. She is not a prop. She is not background scenery. She is the center of this story. And the way the narrative treats her, and the way the man at the center treats her, is the entire point. This is the story the Bible was not supposed to tell, except that it does tell it, completely, without apology, without softening the edges or redirecting the camera at the crucial moment. The ancient text stares directly at the darkest night in the history of the Promised Land and describes what it sees with a precision that has made readers uncomfortable for 3 millennia. And that discomfort is not a reason to look away. It is the reason to look closer. Because buried inside Judges 19, underneath the horror and the silence and the centuries of avoidance, is one of the most searching questions the entire Bible asks about the of human community, sacred responsibility, and what happens when the covenant between God and His people is not just broken, but forgotten entirely. That question has never stopped being relevant. And the answer the text gives, slowly, painfully, across 3 chapters, is the answer that changes everything. Imagine a nation that was built on a covenant, not a political contract, not a constitution negotiated between competing interests, but a covenant, a binding, sacred agreement between a people and the God who rescued them from 400 years of slavery, parted a sea for them, fed them in a desert for 40 years, and then handed them a land already prepared for their arrival. That is Israel entering Canaan under Joshua. That is the starting point. The terms of the covenant were not complicated. Walk in obedience, honor the God who brought you out of Egypt, do not absorb the religious practices of the nations around you, protect the vulnerable, administer justice at the gates of your cities. In exchange, the land would flourish, the rains would come in their seasons, and the enemies that threatened the nation would find no foothold. It was, by any ancient standard, an extraordinary arrangement. And Israel abandoned it almost immediately. The book of Judges opens with a question directed to God. Which tribe shall go up first to fight against the Canaanites? God answers, the tribes move. And for a brief moment, there is momentum, there is obedience, there is the sense that the generation following Joshua might carry forward what Moses and Joshua began. But within the first 2 chapters, the pattern is already breaking down. Judges 2, verse 10, contains one of the most chilling sentences in all of Scripture. "And all that generation also were gathered to their fathers. And there arose another generation after them, who did not know the Lord or the work that he had done for Israel." Read that again with care. An entire generation gone. And the generation that followed them did not know the Lord, not rejected the Lord, not rebelled against the Lord, did not know him. The memory had already been lost. The covenant had already become a story that nobody was telling anymore. What follows in the book of Judges is a cycle that repeats itself 6 times with almost mechanical precision. And understanding this cycle is essential for understanding the world in which Judges 19 takes place. The pattern works like this. Israel abandons the covenant and begins worshipping the gods of the surrounding nations. God withdraws his protection. An enemy nation rises and oppresses Israel, sometimes for decades. Israel cries out under the weight of the oppression. God raises up a judge, a military and spiritual leader, who delivers the nation from its enemy. The land has peace for a generation. And then the judge dies, and the cycle begins again, each time descending a little further than the last. It is not a circle, it is a spiral. And by the time you reach the final chapters of Judges, the spiral has gone so deep that the familiar structure of the cycle has collapsed entirely. The judges themselves tell this story of descent. The early judges, Othniel, Ehud, Deborah, are presented with moral clarity. They are flawed human beings, but their commitment to Israel's God is not seriously in question, and their victories carry genuine theological weight. As the book progresses, the judges become more complicated, more compromised, more difficult to read as straightforward heroes. Gideon starts well and ends badly, building an idolatrous ephod that becomes a snare to his entire family. His son Abimelech, fathered through a Canaanite concubine, a detail the text does not offer casually, seizes power through mass murder and rules as a tyrant until a woman drops a millstone on his head. Jephthah makes a reckless vow that costs his daughter her life. And then there is Samson, a man of supernatural strength and spectacular personal failure, whose entire career as a judge of Israel is driven not by covenant faithfulness, but by personal vendettas and romantic obsessions. The trajectory is unmistakable. The leadership of Israel is decaying in real time, chapter by chapter. But the spiritual decay is not only visible in the judges. It is visible in the land itself. By the period of Judges 19, the worship of Baal and Asherah, the fertility gods of Canaan, has become so thoroughly integrated into Israelite religious life that many people can no longer distinguish it from the worship of their own God. The high places are everywhere. The sacred poles are standing beside altars that were supposed to be consecrated to the Lord alone. Intermarriage with the surrounding nations, which the covenant explicitly prohibited, not out of ethnic prejudice, but because of the spiritual contamination it would inevitably produce, has become commonplace. The Levites, the tribe specifically set apart for priestly service, for teaching the law, for maintaining the sacred memory of the covenant, are wandering, displaced, hiring themselves out to the highest bidder, as we see in the story of Micah that immediately precedes Judges 19. The people who were supposed to be the guardians of Israel's spiritual identity have become spiritual mercenaries. Now picture the physical landscape of this world. The central hill country of Canaan, where most of the action of Judges takes place, is a rugged terrain of limestone ridges, narrow valleys, and ancient roads that wind between walled cities and unwalled villages. There is no capital. There is no centralized administration. The tabernacle, the portable sanctuary that housed the Ark of the Covenant, the physical symbol of God's presence among His people, is sitting at Shiloh, in the territory of Ephraim, largely neglected. The tribal confederacy that Joshua had organized is fraying at every seam. The tribes fight among themselves as often as they fight their external enemies. Communication between the regions is slow and unreliable. And into this fragmented, spiritually disoriented landscape, the man at the center of Judges 19 begins his journey, carrying with him a relationship already fractured, heading toward a city that will become the site of something Israel will spend the next several centuries trying to process. Here is what you need to hold in your mind as we move forward. The phrase, "everyone did what was right in his own eyes," is not describing a society of bold individualists forging their own paths. It is describing a society that has lost the capacity for moral reasoning, because moral reasoning requires a shared standard, and the shared standard, the covenant, the law, the memory of what God had done and what He required, has been systematically abandoned. When there is no king in Israel, the text is not lamenting the absence of a political institution. It is lamenting the absence of the fear of God as the organizing principle of human community. And Judges 19 is the proof of what that absence produces. Not gradually, not in theory, in one night, in one city, in one doorstep, where a woman will be left by the man who was supposed to protect her, and where the silence that follows will be louder than anything the book of Judges has said before. The story begins with two people and a broken relationship. Judges 19, verse 1, introduces us to a Levite living in the remote hill country of Ephraim. And already, before anything has happened, before a single dramatic event has taken place, the text is signaling something important. A Levite was not supposed to simply settle in the hill country of Ephraim and live a private life. The Levites were the priestly tribe of Israel, the descendants of Levi, set apart from the time of the Exodus for sacred service. They had no territorial inheritance of their own, precisely because their inheritance was supposed to be the Lord Himself, His service, His sanctuary, His law. A Levite living as a private citizen in the hill country, far from the tabernacle at Shiloh, is already a picture of displacement. Already a small symptom of the larger spiritual disorder we explored in the last chapter. He is a man out of place before the story even begins. This Levite has a concubine. The Hebrew word is pilegesh, and it is worth pausing on this term because the way it has been translated and interpreted across the centuries has done enormous damage to the way readers understand the woman at the center of this story. In most English translations, concubine carries connotations of a secondary wife, a woman of inferior legal status, perhaps little more than a household servant elevated to a domestic partner. But the reality in ancient Israelite society was considerably more complex. A pilegesh was a formally recognized partner, connected to a man through a real and binding relationship that had legal dimensions and social acknowledgement. Her father is referred to throughout the story as the Levite's father-in-law, the same term used for the father of a full wife. She is not a slave. She is not a purchased servant. She is a woman with a family, with standing, and, as the very next verse makes clear, with the capacity to make an independent decision that changes everything. Judges 19, verse 2, tells us that the concubine was unfaithful to him and left, returning to her father's house in Bethlehem of Judah, where she stayed for 4 months. Now, here is something that many readers glide past without examining. The Hebrew verb used to describe what she did is a subject of genuine scholarly debate. Some manuscripts and translations render it as was unfaithful or played the harlot against him. Others, following different textual traditions, suggest the verb simply means she became angry with him and left. The Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, produced several centuries before the birth of Jesus, uses a word that means she was angry with him, with no implication of sexual infidelity. This is not a trivial difference. If she was unfaithful, the story opens with her as a wrongdoer who nonetheless becomes a victim. If she was angry and left, the story opens with a woman exercising the only form of agency available to her in that society, physically removing herself from a situation that had become intolerable. Either way, she ends up in her father's house, and either way, the Levite comes to get her. The journey to Bethlehem is described with a domestic detail that is almost jarring given what comes later. The Levite travels with 2 donkeys and a servant. He arrives at the woman's father's house. Her father sees him and rejoices. The text says this explicitly in Judges 19, verse 3, and invites him in. What follows is 4 days of hospitality so generous, so extended, so full of eating and drinking, and the father urging the Levite to stay just 1 more day, that scholars have long puzzled over its function in the narrative. Some read it as a genuine picture of ancient Near Eastern hospitality culture, where a host was honor-bound to keep a guest as long as possible. Others read the father's insistence on delay as something more protective. A man reluctant to release his daughter back into a situation he has concerns about, using the tools of hospitality to buy time. The text does not explain the father's motivations. It simply shows us his behavior. And then, on the 5th day, the Levite insists on leaving, and the father lets him go. The decision they make on the road is the hinge on which the entire story turns. They leave Bethlehem late in the afternoon. Too late, the servant suggests, to make it to a city of sufficient size before nightfall. The servant proposes stopping at Gibeah, the city that will later be known as Jerusalem, which at this point in history is still held by the Jebusites, a non-Israelite people. And here the Levite makes a decision that seems, on the surface, entirely reasonable. He refuses to stop in a city of foreigners. He wants to press on to Gibeah, or if not Gibeah, then Ramah, cities of Benjamin, cities of his own people. The logic appears sound. Surely among fellow Israelites, in the territory of a fellow tribe, there will be safety, hospitality, and welcome. Surely among the covenant people, the ancient obligations of care for a traveler will be honored. The Levite's reasoning is understandable. It is also catastrophically wrong, and the terrible irony is that his decision to avoid foreigners in favor of his own people will lead him directly into the most inhospitable place he has ever encountered. They arrive in Gibeah as the sun goes down. The city belongs to the tribe of Benjamin, one of the 12 tribes of Israel, the tribe of the smallest and proudest of Jacob's sons. They sit down in the open square of the city, the public space near the gate where travelers would normally be met, where the customs of hospitality would normally be activated, where any household with the means to offer shelter would be expected to make that offer. They sit, and nobody comes. In the entire city of Gibeah, in this city of Israelites who share the same covenant, the same history, the same God, not one household opens its door to 2 travelers and a servant sitting in the public square after dark. The hospitality that a pagan Jebusite city might have offered, the very hospitality the Levite assumed he would find among his own people, is entirely absent. This is not a minor social awkwardness. In the ancient world, the failure to offer hospitality to a traveler was a serious moral and communal failure. In the covenant world of Israel, it was something even more serious than that. The silence of Gibeah on that evening is already a verdict on the city before anything else has happened. Then an old man appears. He is not from Gibeah originally. The text tells us he is from the hill country of Ephraim, the same region the Levite comes from, working in Gibeah as a sojourner. He sees the travelers in the square, asks where they are going and where they have come from, and when he understands the situation, he urges them not to spend the night in the square. "Come to my house," he says. "Let me provide for all your needs. Do not spend the night in the square." There is an urgency in his invitation that the text captures without explaining. He knows something about Gibeah that the Levite does not yet know, and the warning embedded in his hospitality, "Do not stay in the open, come inside, come quickly," is a warning that the narrative is about to prove was entirely justified. The door is about to close. And outside it, the night of Gibeah is just beginning. They are inside the old man's house now. The doors are closed, the animals have been fed, the travelers have washed their feet. That detail of foot washing is not incidental. It is the ancient Near Eastern signal that a guest has been fully received, that the household has taken on the sacred obligation of protection and care. There is food on the table. There is wine. The worst of the journey, it seems, is behind them. And then the sound begins outside. Judges 19, verse 22, describes it with a phrase that should stop every reader cold. The men of the city, worthless fellows, surrounded the house and began beating on the door. The Hebrew word translated as worthless fellows is Bnei Belial, literally sons of Belial, a term that in the Old Testament consistently describes people who have placed themselves entirely outside the boundaries of the covenant, people for whom no social or moral constraint remains operative. This is not a crowd of curious neighbors. This is something organized, something predatory, something that knows exactly what it wants. What they demand from the old man is explicit. Judges 19, verse 22. "Bring out the man who came into your house, so that we may know him." The Hebrew verb is yada, to know. And here, as in Genesis 19 with the men of Sodom, the context makes the meaning unmistakable. This is not a request for an introduction. This is not a demand that the stranger identify himself to the community. The men of Gibeah want to sexually assault the Levite. The demand is violent, collective, and entirely without shame. Shouted from the street, in the open, in a city of Israel. If you have read Genesis 19, you have heard this scene before. The same night setting, the same surrounded house, the same pounding on the door, the same verb, the same demand. The author of Judges did not stumble into this parallel accidentally. He constructed it with precision because the parallel is the message. What happened to Sodom is now happening in Israel. Detente un segundo and think about what that parallel means theologically. Sodom was not a city of Israel. Sodom was the archetype of pagan wickedness in the ancient Hebrew imagination, a city so thoroughly corrupt that God himself came down to investigate it in Genesis 18. And what he found was so irredeemable that fire and sulfur were the only response. Sodom became, across the entire Old Testament, the shorthand for moral catastrophe, the benchmark of evil against which other evils were measured. The prophets would later use it as the ultimate comparison. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Amos, all of them would invoke Sodom when they wanted to describe Israel or Judah at their most corrupt. But those were metaphors. Judges 19 is not a metaphor. It is a narrative. It is the author of Judges showing you, in real time, that the city of Gibeah, a city of Benjamin, a city of the covenant people, has not merely resembled Sodom, it has become Sodom. The wickedness that Israel was supposed to drive out of Canaan has not been driven out. It has moved in. The old man's response to the mob outside his door is itself deeply troubling, and it would be dishonest to pass over it quickly. He goes outside, an act of courage given the size and of the crowd, and he makes an argument rooted in the ancient code of hospitality. This man is my guest. He is under my roof. I have taken on the obligation of his protection. Do not do this wicked thing. So far, the logic is coherent. What comes next is not. He offers the mob his own virgin daughter and the Levite's concubine instead, urging the crowd to do with them whatever they want, but to leave his male guest alone. Read that carefully. An old man who has just demonstrated genuine moral courage in going outside to face the mob, then offers 2 women as substitutes for 1 man. The text does not editorialize. It does not insert a divine judgment on the old man's offer. It simply records what he said. And that silence from the narrator is itself a form of commentary. Because the story is about to demonstrate, in the most devastating way possible, exactly what it means to treat a woman as a commodity that can be handed over to protect someone else. The mob outside does not accept the old man's offer, not immediately. And this is where the Levite makes the decision that the entire story has been building toward. The decision that reveals, more clearly than anything else in the narrative, exactly who this man is. Judges 19, verse 25, says that the Levite seized his concubine and pushed her outside to them. The Hebrew verb is forceful. This is not a reluctant release, not a desperate compromise made under impossible pressure. It is an act of deliberate self-preservation. The man who traveled to Bethlehem to bring this woman back, who sat for 4 days eating and drinking at her father's table, who presumably had the intention of restoring their relationship, that man takes her by the hand and puts her outside the door so that the crowd will leave him alone. And then, the text tells us, he went to sleep. The parallel with Sodom extends even to the structure of the divine response, except that in Genesis 19, the angels intervened before Lot's daughters were harmed, striking the mob with blindness and pulling Lot back inside. In Judges 19, there is no angel. There is no blinding light. There is no divine hand reaching through the door to pull the concubine back to safety. The intervention that came in Sodom does not come in Gibeah. And the question that raises, the question of divine silence in the face of this specific atrocity, is one of the most searching theological questions the entire book of Judges poses. God is not absent from the story. He speaks later in chapters 20 and 21 when the nation assembles to respond to what happened. But in the night itself, in the hours of the concubine's ordeal, the text offers nothing but darkness and silence. That silence is not an endorsement. It is not indifference, but understanding what it is and why the author of Judges chose to present it this way requires sitting with the discomfort rather than rushing past it toward resolution. By the time the night ends and the first light appears in the sky over Gibeah, the woman has made her way back to the door of the house where the Levite is sleeping. Judges 19, verse 26, describes her falling at the threshold, her hands on the doorstep. That image, a woman collapsed at a threshold, hands reaching toward a door that was closed against her, is one of the most haunting images in all of ancient literature. The threshold is the boundary between the protected space inside and the violent space outside. She has crossed back to it. She has made it to the door, and the door is still closed. In the morning, the Levite rises, opens the door, and prepares to continue his journey. He tells her to get up. She does not answer. She does not move. And in that silence, the story reaches a point from which there is no return. There is a kind of silence in the Bible that is louder than any words surrounding it. It is the silence that falls when the text knows that what happened cannot be adequately described. That language itself begins to fail at the boundary of certain human experiences. That the most honest thing a narrator can do is record the outline of an event and allow the reader's imagination to fill in the space with something approaching the truth. Judges 19 does this with the night of the concubine's ordeal. The text tells us in verse 25 that the men of Gibeah abused her all night until the morning. That is the entirety of what is said about the hours between the door closing and the first light appearing in the sky. No detail, no description, no interior access to what she experienced, or what she felt, or whether she cried out, or whether anyone heard her. Just the fact of it, stated in one sentence, and then the sun rising over Gibeah as if nothing had happened at all. That restraint is not accidental, and it is not squeamishness on the part of the biblical author. The Hebrew Bible is not a text that avoids difficult content. We have already seen that clearly enough. What the author of Judges is doing with this silence is something more deliberate and more disturbing than simply declining to describe the violence. He is making the reader sit in the dark with the concubine. He is refusing to give you the narrative distance that graphic description would actually provide, because graphic description, paradoxically, can become a way of processing and containing an event, of making it into a scene you can observe rather than an absence you have to reckon with. The silence forces you into a different relationship with what happened. You cannot watch it from outside. You can only feel the weight of the hours, the length of the night, and the closed door of the house where the Levite slept. In the morning, the Levite opens the door with the clear intention of continuing his journey. Judges 19, verse 27, describes him stepping over the threshold. The same threshold where the woman is lying, her hands reaching toward the door. His words to her are recorded in the text with a flatness that has disturbed readers for centuries. Get up, let us be going. There is no recorded expression of horror at what he sees. There is no recorded grief, no rage, no cry directed at God or at the city. There is a practical instruction. Get up, we are leaving. She does not answer. She does not move. And the text, in verse 28, says he lifted her onto the donkey and set out for his home. The question of whether she was already dead when he found her, or whether she died during the journey, is left unresolved by the Hebrew text. The grammar at this point is ambiguous in a way that appears again to be intentional. What is not ambiguous is what the Levite does when he arrives home. He takes a knife. He takes the body of his concubine, and he cuts her into 12 pieces, limb by limb, and sends the pieces throughout all the territory of Israel. Judges 19, verse 29. Read it again, carefully. 12 pieces, sent to 12 regions. The number is not coincidental. Israel had 12 tribes, and the Levite is sending one piece of this woman's body to each tribal territory. This is a deliberate act of communication, using the most extreme available symbol to convey the most extreme possible message. In the ancient Near East, cutting an animal in pieces and distributing the pieces was a known method of summoning an alliance to war. We see something similar in 1 Samuel 11, verse 7, when Saul slaughters a pair of oxen and sends the pieces throughout Israel to call the nation to battle. The Levite is doing the same thing. He is calling Israel to respond. The question the text is forcing onto the nation, and onto the reader, is whether they will. But here is what you need to sit with before we move to the nation's response. The Levites' act of cutting the body into 12 pieces and sending them as a call to war presupposes something that the narrative has not yet given us: his own account of what happened. When the men of Israel receive the pieces and assemble at Mizpah, the Levite tells them his version of events. And his version, recorded in Judges 20, verses 4 through 7, is selective in ways that are immediately apparent to anyone who has read chapter 19. He describes the men of Gibeah surrounding the house and intending to kill him. He describes them abusing his concubine until she died. He does not mention that he pushed her out the door. He does not mention that he slept while it happened. He presents himself as a victim and her as a casualty of violence directed at him, and he calls on Israel to respond. The assembled nation hears his account and is outraged. They are outraged at the right thing. The wickedness of Gibeah is real, the crime is real, the demand for justice is legitimate. But the full picture of what happened, including the Levite's own role in it, has already been quietly edited out of the public record. This is one of the details that most readers of Judges 19 miss entirely, because they read the chapter in isolation rather than in sequence with chapter 20. The Levite is not only a man who failed catastrophically to protect the woman in his care. He is also a man who subsequently constructed a narrative about that failure that positioned him as its primary victim. The woman who was handed over, who suffered through the night, who died on the doorstep, she has no voice in the account that goes to the tribal assembly. She has no advocate. Her story, as she experienced it, is not the story that Israel hears. And the nation that mobilizes for war in response to the Levite's account is mobilizing in response to a partial truth, told by the man most implicated in her death, for purposes that serve his need for vindication far more than her need for justice. Why does the Bible preserve this detail? Why does the author of Judges allow the reader to see both the events of chapter 19 and the Levite's retelling of those events in chapter 20, so that the gap between them is visible? Because the gap is the point. The entire book of Judges is a sustained examination of what happens when justice is administered by people who have no fixed moral standard, no accountability before a God who sees everything, no distinction between the truth of an event and the version of that event that serves their interests. The Levite's edited account is not an anomaly in the world of Judges. It is a symptom of the same disease that produced the men of Gibeah. When there is no king in Israel, when everyone does what is right in their own eyes, the powerful tell the story of the powerless in whatever way best serves the powerful. And the powerless, lying in pieces across the territory of Israel, cannot correct the record. Picture the moment when the pieces arrive. A messenger riding into the territory of Dan, or Zebulun, or Reuben, carrying something wrapped in cloth that, when unwrapped, produces a reaction the text describes in Judges 19, verse 30, with extraordinary economy. All who saw it said, "Such a thing has never happened or been seen from the day that the people of Israel came up out of the land of Egypt until this day. Consider it, take counsel, and speak." That response, the collective gasp of a nation confronted with a symbol so extreme that it has no precedent in living memory, tells you everything about the intended effect of the Levite's act. He did not write a letter. He did not send witnesses. He sent the body itself, distributed across the geography of the nation so that every tribe would receive, physically and viscerally, the evidence of what had happened in Gibeah. The 12 pieces were not just a summons to war. They were a forced reckoning. The assembly that follows is one of the largest gatherings described in the entire book of Judges. Judges 20, verse 1, tells us that all the people of Israel came out from Dan to Beersheba and from the land of Gilead. That geographical formula, from Dan in the far north to Beersheba in the south, is the biblical way of saying the entire nation, every corner of the territory, and assembled before the Lord at Mizpah. The number given is 400,000 men bearing swords. Whether that figure is meant literally or functions as a conventional expression of an enormous force, the point is clear. The shock of what happened in Gibeah has accomplished something that the entire book of Judges had not managed to produce before. It has unified the tribes. It has created a collective response. For the first time in generations, Israel is acting as one body rather than as 12 competing interests. The terrible irony is that it took an atrocity of this magnitude to do what the covenant and the worship of God had failed to do. The tribe of Benjamin is given the opportunity to hand over the men responsible. This is the procedure the covenant law prescribed. Justice administered through the community, beginning with the community closest to the crime. The men of Israel send word throughout the tribe of Benjamin, "Deliver the worthless men of Gibeah, so that we may put them to death and purge the evil from Israel." The language echoes Deuteronomy directly, the covenant law of purging evil from the community as a sacred obligation. The assembled nation is, in this moment, attempting to do something right, to apply the covenant framework of justice to a covenant failure of enormous proportions. And the tribe of Benjamin refuses. Judges 20, verse 13. The Benjaminites would not listen to the voice of their fellow Israelites. Instead, they mobilized their own army to defend Gibeah. 26,000 men bearing swords, plus 700 elite left-handed warriors from Gibeah itself, who could sling a stone at a hair and not miss. A detail the text includes, apparently, because even in this darkest chapter of the nation's history, the narrator cannot help noting the extraordinary military skill of the Benjaminites. The tribe has chosen solidarity with its own over justice for the violated. What follows is a civil war of devastating proportions. The first day of battle goes to Benjamin. Israel loses 22,000 men. They weep before the Lord, they fast, they ask whether they should continue, and God says yes. The second day of battle goes to Benjamin again. Israel loses another 18,000 men. 2 days of war, 40,000 Israelite soldiers dead, and the tribe they are fighting is not a foreign enemy, but their own kin, the descendants of the youngest son of Jacob, the tribe that produced the first king of Israel. The losses are catastrophic enough that the assembled nation weeps again, sits before the Lord, fasts until evening, offers burnt offerings and peace offerings. And then, on the third day, with a military strategy involving an ambush from behind, Israel finally breaks Benjamin. Judges 20, verse 48, describes the aftermath with a brutality that matches the brutality that started the whole chain of events. The men of Israel turned back against the Benjaminites and struck them with the edge of the sword, the city, the men, the animals, and all they found. They set fire to all the towns they came across. The numbers given for Benjamin's losses are staggering. 25,100 fighting men of Benjamin fell that day, virtually the entire military force of the tribe. Of the entire tribe, only 600 men escaped into the wilderness and took refuge at the rock of Rimmon, where they stayed for 4 months. The tribe of Benjamin, one of the 12 pillars of the nation of Israel, has been reduced to 600 survivors hiding in the wilderness. The cities are burning. The women and children are dead. One night in Gibeah, one act of collective violence against a single woman has set in motion a chain of consequences that has nearly erased an entire tribe from the face of the earth. This is what the text means when it says that evil must be purged from Israel, not because God is bloodthirsty, but because evil, left unconfronted, does not stay contained. It spreads. It escalates. It eventually produces a reckoning that is almost as destructive as the evil itself. And then comes one of the most disturbing passages in the entire appendix of Judges, the aftermath of the aftermath. The assembled nation, looking at the 600 surviving Benjaminite men hiding at Rimmon, suddenly realizes that they have taken an oath at Mizpah not to give their daughters in marriage to Benjamin. The tribe is going to die out entirely within a generation unless wives can be found for the survivors. So the assembly asks how to solve this problem, and the solution they devise, attacking the city of Jabesh Gilead, killing every man and every woman who has known a man, and bringing back 400 virgin girls as wives for the Benjaminites, then telling the remaining 200 survivors to go and seize girls dancing at the feast at Shiloh, reveals with complete clarity that the nation has not actually learned anything from what happened in Gibeah. The assembly that gathered to purge violence against a woman resolves its final logistical problem by sanctioning violence against women on a larger scale. The covenant violation that started with one woman handed over at a doorstep ends with hundreds of women seized, taken, and distributed. And the text simply records it, without a single word of divine approval, as the last act of a nation doing what is right in its own eyes. The symmetry is almost unbearable once you see it. Judges 19 opens with a woman who exercised agency, who left, who went home, who made a choice, and ends with her treated as an object to be handed over and destroyed. Judges 20 and 21 open with a nation that exercised moral clarity, that assembled, that demanded justice, that purged an evil, and end with that same nation treating hundreds of women as objects to be seized and distributed in order to solve a demographic problem. The concubine's story did not end with her death on the doorstep of the old man's house in Gibeah. It ended with the nation that claimed to be outraged by her death committing, in her name, a series of acts that replicated the very logic that killed her. That is not irony. That is diagnosis. There is a question that has been present underneath every chapter of this story, patient and unresolved, waiting for the moment when we could finally look at it directly. Why is Judges 19 in the Bible? Not why did it happen. Human beings are capable of atrocity, and the historical record of every civilization confirms that with exhausting regularity. The question is why it was preserved, why a text that Jewish and Christian traditions have regarded for millennia as the inspired word of God contains, without apology and without a redemptive resolution attached to it, one of the most disturbing narratives in ancient literature. There are passages of the Bible that are difficult because they describe divine judgment. There are passages that are difficult because they contain commandments that modern readers find hard to reconcile with their understanding of a loving God. Judges 19 is difficult for a different reason entirely. It is difficult because it describes human evil in such unflinching detail and responds to that evil with such structural ambiguity that the reader cannot find a comfortable place to stand while reading it. And that discomfort is the answer to the question. The book of Judges was not written as a historical archive. It was written as a warning. The entire structure of the book, the cycles of apostasy and deliverance, the descending quality of the judges, the final appendix with its 2 devastating case studies, is a prosecutorial argument addressed to a specific audience at a specific moment in Israel's history. Most scholars believe the final form of Judges was shaped during the period leading up to or following the Babylonian exile, when the nation of Israel was confronting the catastrophic consequences of centuries of covenant unfaithfulness. The editors who gave us the book of Judges in its final form were saying to their audience, "Look at where this road leads. Look at what a society becomes when the fear of God is replaced by the sovereignty of individual appetite. Look at Gibeah." Because Gibeah is not a cautionary tale about one wicked city in the territory of Benjamin. Gibeah is a mirror. And the question the text is asking, across 3,000 years of readership, is whether the face looking back at you from that mirror is familiar. The prophet Hosea, writing in the 8th century before the birth of Jesus, invokes Gibeah 3 times as the defining image of Israel's corruption. Hosea 9, verse 9. "They have deeply corrupted themselves, as in the days of Gibeah." Hosea 10, verse 9. "From the days of Gibeah you have sinned, O Israel." Gibeah was not forgotten. It became the shorthand for a particular kind of moral collapse. The kind that happens not in spite of religious identity, but alongside it, within it, in a community that still performs the rituals of covenant, while the substance of the covenant has already drained away. The men of Gibeah were not pagans worshipping foreign gods on that night. They were Israelites. They were Benjaminites. They were members of the covenant community. And that is precisely what made what they did so theologically catastrophic. Evil committed by outsiders is terrible. Evil committed by the people of God, from within the community of the people of God, is something the biblical authors treat as an entirely different order of crisis. Now think about the present moment. Not as an abstraction, not as a rhetorical gesture, but as a genuine and searching question. The conditions that produced Gibeah were specific. A community that had lost its shared moral standard, where individual appetite had displaced covenant obligation as the organizing principle of social life, where the vulnerable had no reliable protection because the systems designed to protect them had been captured by the powerful, and where the religious infrastructure that was supposed to maintain the memory of God's requirements had become self-serving and displaced from its purpose. Ask yourself honestly, how many of those conditions describe something you recognize? The technological context is entirely different. The cultural forms are entirely different. But the underlying architecture, a society increasingly organized around individual sovereignty, where the concept of binding moral obligation to something beyond personal preference is treated as an imposition rather than a foundation, is not as foreign as we might like to believe. Jesus himself reached back to the period of the Judges when he wanted to describe the conditions that would precede the end of the age. In Matthew 24, verse 37, he said, "As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man." The days of Noah. That phrase points to the same era the book of Judges is examining, the same pattern of moral and spiritual collapse that produces catastrophic divine response. The connection Jesus draws is not primarily about specific sins, but about a specific condition, a world that has become so thoroughly normalized to its own corruption that it can no longer recognize the corruption as corruption. The people in the days of Noah, Jesus says, were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, right up until the day Noah entered the ark. Not because they were unusually wicked in that moment, but because they had entirely lost the capacity to perceive what was coming. The warning system was broken. The conscience of the civilization had been so thoroughly recalibrated by its own decline that it could no longer read the signals. Does that sound familiar? The concubine of Judges 19 has no name in the text. She is identified only by her relationship to the Levite, by her status as a pilegesh, by her connection to her father's household in Bethlehem. She speaks no recorded words. She takes one action, leaving, and then the story acts upon her rather than through her for the remainder of the narrative. Her namelessness is not an accident of historical record-keeping. In a text that preserves the names of minor characters across hundreds of chapters, the decision to leave this woman unnamed is a deliberate authorial choice. Some scholars have suggested it is a way of making her representative rather than individual. She stands for every woman, every vulnerable person, every human being handed over by those who should have protected them in order to serve the interests of those with power. Her story is particular and specific, rooted in a real night, in a real city, in the hill country of Canaan. And it is also, simultaneously, a story that has never stopped happening. The Bible preserved Judges 19 because truth that is suppressed does not disappear. It accumulates pressure. The stories we refuse to tell, the atrocities we edit out of the official record, the inconvenient testimonies we allow to be overwritten by the self-serving accounts of those with something to hide, they do not vanish. They wait. And the God who inspired the authors of Scripture to include this story in the canon of sacred text is the same God who said in Luke 12 verse 3 that everything covered up will be uncovered, and everything spoken in darkness will be heard in the light. Judges 19 is an act of divine insistence on the record. It will not let the concubine be forgotten. It will not let Gibeah be sanitized. It will not let the Levite's edited account stand as the final word. It sits in the middle of the most widely read book in human history and says, this happened, this matters, and the conditions that made it possible are not safely confined to the ancient past. The question the text leaves you with is not an academic one. It is the most personal question imaginable. You have heard the story now. You have seen the mirror. What are you going to do with what you see?